Today is June 1st, 2009. I am Andrea Mott. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Napoleon, North Dakota. Can you please state your full name, including maiden name?
Theresa Meier Eissinger.
When and where were you born?
I was born right here in Napoleon on March 19, 1929.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
Yes, I was one of a twin. My mother had twins on that day, and my brother sadly died. But my aunts used to talk about how my mother couldn't find a dress that was big enough to wear because she was having these twins, and each one of us weighed over 8 pounds. So she had to split her dresses open and wear an apron over it. There were no maternity dresses at that time.
Was a midwife or doctor present?
Midwife.
Do you know what she did to help your mother with the twin, with you and your brother?
Oh heavens, that was never talked about. We didn't talk about babies or anything like that.
Could you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
Well, I remember one day we went to a country school, you know. And my sister and I were the two youngest in the family. And we always walked, as kids, we always walked to school. And it was a mile if we cut across the fields. Around the road, it was closer to 2 miles, so we always cut across. Well, this one morning, it was brutally cold. So my father said he thought we could get a ride that day. And my sister was in the 1st grade, and I was 2 years older. And the next one to me was a brother, and he was 5 years older than me. So my father said my brother was old enough to handle a horse. And we had to use the stone boat. A stone boat is just a platform on sled runners. And there is no sides, so it's nothing to hang on to. And in the front, there's a chain on each side which gets hooked up to the harness. We used only one horse, and that was our ride. And the stone boat was used all the time to manure the barn, so it didn't smell so good either. So my father put a little jag of hay on the stone boat. My sister and I sat on the hay, and we were hanging on to the dinner pails. You know, at that time it was just breakfast, dinner, and supper. And anything in between was a lunch. So, because we ate our noon meal, which was dinner, we would call them dinner pails. And ours were always a syrup pail. My mother bought syrup by the gallon, and it made a dandy dinner pail. It was deep, so you put a lot of stuff in it. It had a lid, and it had a handle, so it was easy to carry. So my sister and I were sitting on the stone boat with the dinner pails. My father threw an old blanket or a quilt over us to keep us warm, and we took off. Well, my brother was out in the open. He was driving the horse. I suppose he was cold, so he whipped the horse up pretty good. And we always had a lot of snow, it seemed like. And there was this big snowbank. Of course, we couldn't see anything. We were under the blanket. And so he went up this steep snowbank, and my sister and I slid off the back. Us and the hay and the dinner pails and the blankets and the whole works, and went tumbling down the snowbank. And one of the dinner pails opened, and the lunch spilled out. So we were scrabbling around there, picking up our lunch, a sandwich and a hard-boiled egg and an apple. Well, we got everything loaded back up again, and we did make it to school. But it was the very last time we ever caught a ride. After that, we always walked.
And how old were you when you did this?
Well, I suppose I was 7 or 8.
Did your other siblings go to school?
Yes, they did. I have 5 brothers and sisters older than I am, and they all graduated from the 8th grade. So at that time, when you finished the 8th grade, you had to take a test, and the test was given to you by the superintendent of schools. And if you passed it, you were done. If you didn't pass it, you had to go back to school again until Christmas time, and then take the test over again. And all 5 of my older brothers and sisters did graduate from the 8th grade. And my younger sister and I were the only 2 that graduated from high school.
Was it common for you to help out on the farm at home?
Oh, heavens, yes. We did everything. We milked cows, and when we got older, we worked in the fields during haying time. We shocked, we picked rocks, we picked corn. We helped all the time.
What kind of chores did you perhaps share with your sister?
Well, we had to help with the milking. When we first started milking, we were pretty small yet. My mother would usually, it was an older cow that was real tame, and she'd milk it down to just the very end, which was called stripping the cow. And then we would finish milking the cow. And that's how we learned. Then when we got older and stronger, then we could milk the cow from beginning to end. And when we came home from school, especially in the wintertime, we had to carry water into the house because there was no running water. And we had to carry the coal in. And everybody had chores.
Did you have a favorite?
None. No favorite at all.
Now, you said you did outside chores. Did you ever do any of the inside chores?
Well, yes, we had to help my mother. We did wash the dishes and wash the separator and scrub the floor when we were older. Everybody was busy.
Now, as far as your farmhouse was concerned, what did it look like?
Oh my, it was 3 rooms and a little entry. And there were 7 children and my parents, which was 9 people, living in 3 rooms.
How many siblings did you share with?
There were 7 of us. And there was, of course, no electricity and no running water and no closets. Things we take for granted now. No built-in cupboards. There was just a freestanding cupboard. Of course, in those days, they didn't have all the dishes and stuff that we do nowadays. And we didn't have the clothes either. You had one dress for summer and one for winter, and that was it.
So what was it like growing up in the dirty 30s then?
It was hard. It was hard. We wore hand-me-downs. And the hand-me-downs didn't always come from an older sister. They could have come from a neighbor or a cousin or anyone. And at one time, my mother got this coat. It was a good, warm winter coat. And I was the one that, I guess it fit me the best. But it was so long. And nobody wore, not the kids, they didn't wear long clothes like that. And so I didn't want to wear it. And she said, you wear this coat when you're walking in the cold, and then your legs will be warm, and the rest of the kids will be cold. Well, that reasoning didn't go over so well with me, so I cried. And by that time, my mother's patience ran out. She took me across her knee and a few good slaps on the behind, and I left for school wearing the long coat.
Any other memories that you have from the dirty 30s?
Oh, like I said, it was hard. We always had enough to eat. We always had enough clothes, nothing extra, and it was always warm in the house. But those were the basics, and there was nothing else besides that. There were nothing frivolous, nothing at all, just the basics. But looking back, we didn't know any better. Everybody was in the same boat, and we were happy.
Now, you said you always had enough to eat. Now, what kind of meals would your mother make?
Oh, meat and potatoes. Meat and potatoes. And during Lent, fish. At that time, the fish were sold by the grocery store. They had them setting in wooden boxes out in front of the store. And my mother would pick out the fish, and she would have to, they were the scales on and the head and everything. She had to do the cleaning. But we did eat a lot of fish during Lent.
Was your family very religious?
Oh, yes, yes. We never missed a Sunday Mass unless it was absolutely impossible to get there. In the wintertime, if there was a lot of snow, we used to bobsled. We went to Mass on Christmas Eve one time with the bobsled. And we'd always stop at my Grandma and Grandpa Coon's house. And when it was time to go to Mass, we would walk from Grandma's to the church. And a little before Mass ended, my father would go out and he'd hitch the horses back up and bring the sled around to the front of the church, and we piled in and went home.
Was it pretty common to take a bobsled?
Oh, yes, yes. Very.
Did your family or you and your siblings often visit your grandparents and stuff?
Yes, we did every Sunday. Every Sunday.
What kind of activities would you do at your home?
Well, we were, most of the time, in the summertime, we weren't allowed to come into the house. We had to stay outside. And usually we stopped there before Mass. My parents would visit with them for a little bit, and then we'd go to church. But all my uncles and aunts lived within a couple of miles, and we would visit them a lot. And sometimes in the wintertime with the bobsled.
And what kind of things would you do with your cousins and aunts?
Oh, we played tag and pom-pom pull-away. And
Now, what is pom-pom pull-away?
Well, you had two sides and you had a rope, and they'd yell pom-pom pull-away, and you would pull on the rope and see which side won.
Who would usually win?
Well, usually the one side with the bigger kids.
Were you often on that side?
Not too often.
So besides tag and pom-pom pull-away, what other things activities?
Well, during school, in the fall, we played baseball. We knew there was such a thing as baseball, but we didn't know the rules or anything. We knew there was a home plate and 3 bases, and that was it. So the 2 oldest boys, they were the captains, and they picked their teams, first one, then the other side. And the little ones, they were always left for the end, Nobody wanted them. Well, the teacher insisted that the little ones, they get a chance at bat. So a little girl would get up there, and she would hit the ball out, and she'd get to first base. And then another little one would get up, and he'd hit the ball out, and he'd run to first base. Well, the little girl that was on first base was scared to run, so she just stayed where she was at. Sometimes we had 3 on 1 base.
How would those games usually end?
In a fight.
Now, what kind of things could you do in the winter?
Well, at school, we just run outside and play in the snow. And at home, in the evening, we played cards. And my parents played with us. We did play cards. But we had no reading material. We had no games. Never, ever owned a game. So, but most of the time, by the time you were done with chores, you were ready to go to bed.
Now, you talked about school quite a bit. When did you start going to country school?
1st grade and through the 8th grade.
Was that what it was called, just country school? What did the school have to do?
Well, it was Kraber Country School.
And how far was it?
A mile if we cut across the fields.
Do you remember how many students?
Oh, I suppose 14, 15, but when my older brothers, my 2 older sisters, when they started, they had a lot more. There were a lot more kids. There were 20, 25 kids. 1 teacher, all 8 grades, and sometimes they didn't know how to understand. Well, they couldn't understand or speak a word of English. So the poor teacher had to first teach them the English language before she could start teaching them reading or arithmetic.
Now, as far as activities in the classroom, what kind of things did you do?
Well, we had penmanship, we had drawing, and that was about it that we did in the school.
What was your favorite?
Drawing.
I'd like to talk about maybe some of your favorite memories from school. Something that stand out?
Yes, the Christmas program. I always looked forward to that. And every year we did have a Christmas program. We would have skits and sing Christmas carols. We'd have solos and duets. And the school was jam-packed. All the family would be there. And sometimes they'd even go to town and get Grandma and Grandpa to come out for the program. And, of course, there was no electricity, so the farmers brought lanterns. And they just drove a nail into the wall and hung the lanterns around the wall of the school. And at the end, we got a little bag from the teacher, usually peanuts and some hard candy. That was the best of it.
Now, did you play any roles in the skits? Or
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, I did.
Some of them?
I don't remember the skits, but I know we had them, and I know I was in it because we had to memorize the lines.
Now, after you left country school, where did you go?
To high school in Napoleon.
Was that a big transition?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was.
Now, when you went to school in Napoleon, what kinds of courses did you take?
Oh, we had algebra, we had English, we had history, we had science, Phi-Ed.
Did you have a favorite?
Yes, English and literature. Those were my favorites.
Did you participate in any kind of after-school activities or in-school activities?
I was in one of the school plays. When we were sophomores, we had to put on a play to earn money to put on the prom the next year, and I was in the play. But after school, we had to go home. There was no time for anything. We had to go home and do chores.
What is your favorite memory about high school?
Oh, graduation, I suppose.
Can you explain it a little bit?
Well, it was, I was the first one in the family that graduated, so it was a big deal, you know. And of course, there I was getting all this attention.
But that was difficult for your siblings.
Oh, yes, it was.
Now, at that point, did your parents have any books in the home when you?
No. We never had any books.
Can you tell me a little bit about maybe your mother? What was she like?
My mother was born and raised in Russia, the Ukraine, in the Crimean Valley, in a little village named Rosenthal. And she came over with her whole family, 16 in all, on April 1st, 1911. They went through Ellis Island, and they made their way to Napoleon, North Dakota, and bought a farm. And that's where she grew up. Of course, she was 17 when they came over. So she remembered what it was like living in Russia, and she remembered the voyage. She told us how terrible that ocean voyage was. It took so long. It took them 3 months to get here. And when I went over to the Ukraine, well, we flew over in a matter of hours. And it took them 3 months. And she said they got so seasick, and it was hard. There was no privacy. They were jammed in there, and 16 in one family. It was a hard trip. If anyone died, they were buried at sea. And she said it was just a hard voyage.
Now, what other memories did she have of growing up in Russia?
Well, she remembered the fruit. They had fruit trees there. They could go out and pick apples and peaches off of the tree. And she said she had never tasted fruit that was quite that good. And the climate there is so wonderful. They have an almost perfect climate. And when they got here, of course, the first winter with all the snow and the ice and the cold, she said they cried more that first year than they did all the rest of their lives. And she said if they would have had the money, they would have gone back. But they couldn't afford it anymore, so they had to stay.
What made them immigrate?
Well, it was the taxes. They were taxed so high. They had to serve in the military, and that's the two main reasons.
Did your father ever serve in the military?
No.
What was your father like?
He was born in the region of Odessa. And when he was 21 years old, his father gave him the equivalent of $200 in American money and told him, you go to the United States. We have relatives there. That's the thing for you to do. And how the man ever made it is beyond me, because he was very shy and very bashful, and he was all alone. My mother had her family with her, but he was all by himself. But he did make it, and he did arrive in Napoleon.
Did he ever share stories about his journey?
Not at all. He didn't talk much about his life in Russia. He just never, ever mentioned much about it. Whatever we learned through our mother.
Now, your father was a farmer.
Oh, yes, and so were his people before him.
Are any of your family members still farming?
No.
So I'm assuming that you had a lot of chores that your father would show you how to do around the farm.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. One was when we picked corn. We always had to wait until there was a good hard frost. Then after school and all day Saturday, we had to pick corn. And he showed us how to do that. Well, my younger sister and I, we only picked one row. But my father and my brothers, they picked 2 rows at a time. And my father would be way ahead of us, and he'd come back and, oh, if you forgot a cob, you had to go back and pick it. He was a taskmaster, all right. Oh, yes, and it had to be done right.
Can you describe the actual homestead that you grew up on?
There was a small barn, a small house, and then there was, it was a long building. It was a granary with a garage attached to the end of it. And the garage had just a dirt floor. And those were the only buildings we had. And the windmill. That was it.
So your family didn't have any animals then?
Oh, yeah, we had all the animals. We had hogs and chickens and geese and ducks and cattle and dogs and cats.
And what were some of those animals used for?
The horses were always used for work horses. We were not allowed to ride them, so I never learned how to ride. My father said horses are for work, they are not for pleasure. So that was the end of that.
What about the dogs? Were those?
We always had a dog, and we always had lots of cats. And it was not anything special. It was just a mongrel dog. And I never really did like dogs, so I didn't spend too much time with the dog.
Did your family ever butcher?
Yes.
Animals?
Oh, yes. We butchered the chickens, of course. And the goose, we always had a Christmas goose on Christmas Day. And we butchered hogs.
Now, that Christmas goose, how would your mother prepare that?
She stuffed it and roasted it in the oven.
Did that take a long time?
Oh, yeah. Everything had to be done from scratch, you know.
Can you describe the roads out to your farm?
Oh, my. There was no gravel on it. If it rained, it was mud. And the first snowfall, and you were blocked in because at that time the county didn't come out and open the roads like they do nowadays, because nowadays they have school buses, of course, and at that time the kids on the farm, they all went to country school. None of those roads were ever open. Even Highway 3 going through town was just a gravel road. And so we had to go by bobsled as soon as there was enough snow on the ground. And sometimes it would be muddy. We'd have to drive through the pasture to get to a spot where it wasn't so muddy, and then into the pasture again. And that's the way we made our way into town.
How long would it take you to do?
Oh, we only lived out 5 miles, but I suppose it took half hour or 45 minutes. And sometimes you'd have a flat tire yet on top of it all.
Can you describe the bobsled for us?
It was a pretty long, runners, and we hitched up 2 horses, and it was big enough to carry the whole family.
So would your father hook up just a couple of horses?
2 horses. Mm-hmm.
Now, what were the reasons your family was going to town?
Church. Not so much shopping, because they bought mostly everything that they needed in the fall. And what they couldn't buy, they raised on the farm. So there was not much grocery shopping in the wintertime.
Do you remember seeing any differences between farm children and those raised in town?
Yes, we thought they were dressed better. Of course, they didn't milk cows. I guess maybe they smell better, too.
Did you ever have any friends in town?
No, none except my cousins. I did have an uncle and aunt that lived in town, and they're girls. But other than that, we didn't get to town that often.
Now, when you were attending high school here, did that change a little?
Yes, it did. Then I had friends in town, yes.
Did you ever, you mentioned prom earlier, and I kind of want to touch on that a little bit. Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, it was the first time I got to wear a long dress, and it was a really big deal. I didn't go with a boy. I don't know if I did have chances, but I just turned them down. I just went by myself.
And what was that like?
Oh, there were a lot of girls that went by themselves, so I had a lot of company.
What about the dance? What was that?
Yeah, we had a dance, and the gym was decorated. And when we were sophomores, we decorated for the juniors. When we were juniors, we decorated for the seniors. And the ones behind us, in turn, decorated for us.
What kind of decorations did they put up?
Oh, crepe paper.
What about the music they would play at the time? What was that like?
Well, they had a band. It wasn't an old-time band, but it was live music. A horn and a drum. That's about it. Horns and a drum.
Now, we did touch on dances a little bit. How about pep rallies? Did your school have any pep rallies?
Yes, we did, but I never took much. I wasn't in on that because I had to go home to chores.
Again, I guess that points out the difference between town.
Town and yes, it certainly does.
Well, is there anything else about high school that you would like to share with us?
Well, that was about it, I guess. You went to school. You didn't dare wear slacks. There was no such a thing as slacks. You had to wear a dress no matter how cold it was. There was a dress code, and you had to adhere to it. And no long hair for the boys.
What was the dress code for the girls?
You had to wear a dress. You absolutely had to wear a dress.
Well, can you describe what Napoleon looked like to you?
At that time?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was of course, some of the buildings have changed on Main Street. There was Mitzman's grocery store right in the middle of the north side of the street. And there was a big cottonwood tree right in front of the store. And they had benches out there. And I remember in the summertime, usually the old men, they would sit in the shade in front of Mitzman's store.
Is there any other place in town like that where they still sit in front of?
No, that's a thing of the past. One of my favorite places was the drugstore. They had a soda fountain. And oh, it smelled so good in there. I would just go in there and stand there just for the smell. We didn't have any money, so we just would stand around.
Did you like the soda too?
Oh, yes. Once in a while, we would get a dime or so, and we could buy some ice cream.
Homemade?
at the soda pop.
Do you know what the population of the family was when you were growing up?
I think it was right around 1,500.
Now you mentioned the drugstore and the grocery store. What other kind of businesses were they at that time?
They had a blacksmith, which is no longer. There was the Ford garage was on Main Street, which is not there any longer. The Homestead has been there forever. And the post office was on Main Street. Everything was on Main Street. Now it's a little bit spread out more.
How about churches? Do you know how many churches were there?
Oh, there were a lot of churches. There must have been 8 or 9.
And what was the name of your church?
St. Philip Neri.
Do you remember how many people used to go to church there?
Oh, there were over 300 families. And a lot of kids. A lot of kids. We had religious instruction during the summertime, during the month of June. The nuns would come from Hankinson and they would teach us religion. And we were divided into groups. The little ones that were not ready to make their first communion were in one group. The ones making their first communion were in the second group. And the third, then the older ones, you had to be 12 to be confirmed. That was a group. And then there were the rest of them that fell in between those groups. And the whole month of June. And I had one dress. I had one summer dress. I wore it the whole month. I wore it every day, 5 days. On Saturday, my mother washed it and dried it, ironed it, and wear it to church on Sunday, and then all the rest of the week. We had no problem deciding what to wear.
Was that difficult? Did anybody else?
Everybody was the same. They all came in the same clothes.
Can you describe a typical Sunday?
A typical Sunday? Mass was at 10:30. And, of course, you had to do all the chores first, milk the cows, and separate and feed all the animals. My mother butchered an old hen because there was always chicken noodle soup for dinner. And all of that had to be done before we went to church. And church was long. It was a long sermon, and then there was benediction. It must have been at least 12:30 by the time we got back home. And my mother used to cook the chicken until we left for church, so it would be half cooked by the time we got back, so it wouldn't take so long.
And when would you usually have your afternoon meal?
Usually around, well, on Sunday it was later, but during the week it was usually around noon.
So once you returned home from church, what was your...
Well, my father, he'd take off his suit coat, but he'd stay in his Sunday shirt, which he had one of. And my mother stayed in her Sunday dress. She wore an apron. And sometimes they'd go visiting, or somebody would visit us. And when they would go visiting, there were no telephones. You just went to whoever you picked out. If they were home, fine. If not, you went to the next farm till you found somebody at home.
Now, what was a typical service like when you were a child?
When I was, like 7 or 8, the sermon was still in German. But it was only later on that it switched to English.
So did you grow up speaking German?
Oh, yes. And in church, the men sat on the right-hand side, the women on the left-hand side. No husband and wife ever sat together. Never. Way in the back were the pregnant ladies. And the ones that had babies. And then were the old women, the old grandmas. And then were the teenagers, and way up in front were the little ones. And you weren't too very big, and not too very old before they would send you up front. And if you didn't behave, it was just once. After that, you behaved.
Did you ever have to sit in front?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
What was that like?
Scary. My mother wasn't there.
Did the church ever hold any
Yes, we had St. Philip Neri feast day is the 25th of May, and we always had a meal that was open to the public on that day. I think it was the only fundraiser that they had.
And I think those are called fall suppers.
Yes, when we had ours in the spring because of the feast day.
Is that church still?
No, we haven't done that in a long time.
What was your favorite holiday?
Christmas, I think. On Christmas Eve, my mother would get out the soup plates. They were those round, flat ones. And as many children as there were, each one got a soup plate full of goodies. There'd be peanuts, and she bought the mixed nuts. We never had a nutcracker. We used the hammer. And we'd have the hard candy. The ribbon were my favorite because they were bigger pieces. And we would have the chocolate cookies. They had a base, a baked base, and then there was soft marshmallows covered in chocolate. And oh, they were so good. There was one of those, and an orange, and the animal crackers. We always got animal crackers. And my two brothers, well, they were raised on the farm. It was just taken for granted that they would be farmers. So they used matchboxes for buildings. They played farm. And my mother, God bless her, she saved everything, every piece of string and every piece of paper. And they used string for fences. And those animal crackers, there were cows and there were horses and sheep, but there were also giraffes and lions and tigers. So my sister and I would trade with my brothers. We'd give them a horse and they'd give us a tiger. Well, pretty soon we got wise to this, so we said, well, we want two instead of one. And my brother said, well, that isn't fair. And I said, well, I held the cow up to my mouth and I said, give me two tigers or I'm going to eat this cow. He caved in. So my sister and I always had more animal crackers than the brothers did.
Did you ever trade any other kind of food?
Oh, yes, yes. And sometimes we had to. If you had to stay in during recess at school, you would give your brothers and sisters anything if they wouldn't tattle on you, because if they told my parents that I had to stay in after school, not after school, but during recess or noon hour, I knew I would get a whipping because the teacher was always right and you were wrong. So I'd give up every piece of dessert and everything I owned until they forgot about it.
Did your family celebrate Easter?
Not really. We did have, instead of Easter baskets, in the fall, my father would take a pail of ground into the granary, and he always knew just exactly when to bring it in to the house, so it would thaw. And we would use a coffee can, and we'd put some ground in the can, and he'd give us some oats. We'd sprinkle oats and put a little more ground on top, and water it and set it in the window in the sun. And of course, conditions were perfect. The oats would sprout and would grow and into grass. That was our Easter basket. And on Sunday morning, we'd find Easter candy in our baskets, in our grass.
Did your mother ever make any special meals for Easter?
No, she did bake kuchen for Easter. And I believe pie. I think we had pie on Easter Sunday.
Now, what is kuchen?
Kuchen is a German dish. It's made out of dough, and you put a topping on it and fruit, and sprinkle a little sugar and cinnamon top and bake it. Very good, I think.
Now, another holiday would be the 4th of July. Did your family celebrate?
Oh, that was a great day for us. No work was done on that day. You know, my parents came from Russia, where they had no say in anything. And they came to this country, and once they became citizens, they were so proud of being citizens of this country. And Independence Day was celebrated. We would do the chores in the morning. As soon as they were done, we would head for town. And I think we each got maybe a dime. And you could buy a lot of things for a dime. You know, there were a lot of penny things you could buy. And they had the rides, you know, the Ferris wheel. We never went on rides. I think they cost a nickel. But if we'd spend a nickel for a ride, we had nothing to show for it. And even at that early age, we always spent our money on something that you could see and hold. And we'd be in town all day. At noon, my mother went to the grocery store. She bought a loaf of bread and a couple of rings of bologna, and we each got a bottle of soda pop. And at that time, it was all in bottles and all different kinds of flavors. I bet it took us 5 minutes to decide what flavor. And if the weather was hot, she bought a watermelon. And we would go to the park, and we'd eat our lunch in the park. If it was raining, we ate in the car. Never even thought of going to a restaurant.
So you had a big picnic.
Oh, yes. And in the evening, when it was time to do the chores, we'd go home, do the chores, get ready again, go back to town, and they would have fireworks in the evening. So it was a great day.
Do you remember the first time you saw fireworks?
Well, I just every year from when I grew up, they always had fireworks on 4th of July.
Now, do you remember any games that you would play on the phone?
Oh, yes, they had kid games, you know. They had races, and sometimes you were lucky enough to come in third or fourth, and you'd get a nickel, so you had an extra nickel. And they had a parade. It was a big day.
Now, what was the parade like? Can you describe that?
Well, there was a lot of horses, a horse-drawn. They didn't have the fancy floats like they do nowadays, but they decorated with crepe paper. And they had horses and wagons and...
Did you ever ride in them?
No, never got to ride in the parade.
Now, did your family celebrate birthdays?
Never. Birthday was of no consequence whatsoever. Your mother told you, today is your birthday, and that's as far as it went.
Did you ever feel like you missed out on not having a birthday?
No, never. Nobody else had a birthday party, or, well, that was unheard of. So we just didn't feel any different.
How about celebrating the name's day?
Oh, yes. My father's name was John, and that's on the 27th of December. And there were always a lot of people at our house that night celebrating his name's day. And, of course, my parents went to other farms, other places where they celebrated the name's day. And they took their kids with them. So we got to go, too.
Now, what kind of things did you do with them?
They played cards, you know, the older people. They played cards, and they visited, and they had lunch, and around midnight, we'd go home.
And how about participating in, they have things like sausage parties or communal butchering or cooking parties?
Oh, yes, the communal butchering. We always had 4 or 5 of the uncles and aunts that came to our house when we butchered. I hated it. I just hated it. The smells and I did not like it. And we always butchered like 2 or 3 large hogs because that was the only meat we had over the winter. They'd freeze it. The hams were frozen. The sausage was frozen. And the spare ribs were put in brine. And from then on, we had sausage every day. Every day. Except Sunday. The rest of the time, every day.
Were you ever sick of it?
Yeah, yeah.
And how about any other holidays? Did your family participate in any other holidays that you know of mention?
No, Thanksgiving was just, we went to Mass on Thanksgiving Day to give thanks for what you had, and that was as far as it went. There was anything extra special about it.
I'm going to jump topics just a little bit. I'd like to talk about your grandparents
Okay.
a little bit. When they moved here, were you still a small child?
I wasn't born.
Remember them?
Oh, yes, I remember them. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes,
Can you
yes.
describe your maternal grandparents?
Yes, they were, well, from the time that I remember them, they lived in town. And we were always a little bit scared of them because they demanded so much respect. We were always afraid we'd say or do the wrong thing. But they were good to us. I don't know why we were so scared of them. But I remember one incident. My oldest sister, it was harvest time. And there was enough grain so they could haul some of it to town to sell. And my father said she was old enough to handle a team, and so she was bringing a load of grain into town. And when she passed, it's a grove of trees north of town. We called it the Wildwoods. When she passed there, this man came running out of the woods. And of course, she got scared, so she whipped up the horses and she got away from him. My grandparents lived right alongside the highway. And as luck would have it, when she got to Grandpa's house, he was outside. And she was crying, so he asked her what was wrong. And she told him. So he told her, you take that load of grain to the elevator, and then you come back and you stop here. And so she did. And he got into the grain box, and he had a stick with him, and he laid down on the floor. And she drove out of town. When they got to the Wildwoods, here this same man came running out of the Wildwoods. And my grandpa stood up and he waved the stick and he told the man exactly what he would do to him if he ever bothered this girl again. And she never saw hide or hair of him again. They took care of their own. There was no 911. There was no calling the sheriff or the cops. There, nothing. You just took care of everything yourself.
Now, what was your grandmother like? Did she ever make a lot of meals?
Yeah, she did, yeah. But my Aunt Caroline lived with my grandparents, and it was Aunt Caroline, I think, that did most of the cooking and most of the chores around the house. My grandma was a little woman. I can remember her wearing the long dresses. Her dresses were always down to the ground, to the top of the shoes. And she said she always wore 3 or 4 petticoats. I don't know why, but she did.
Now, what was the typical dress when you were growing up? What kind of clothes did you wear?
On the farm, we wore bib overalls. There were no jeans. So, and that's what we wore to school. You had 2 pair of good jeans, bib overalls, and a shirt. So 1 week you wore one, and then the next week this was in the wash, and you wore the other set. And if you got dirty in between, oh my, that was a big deal because that just threw everything out of kilter. My mother had to wash extra. You very seldom got dirty. You were pretty careful.
You paid attention.
Yes, you did. You didn't roll on the ground or anything like that.
So getting dirty while doing chores was not.
There it was different. We'd come home and we would change clothes. There you would get dirty there.
Now, your grandfather seems like an interesting character. Can you describe him a little bit?
Yes, when they came from Russia, he was 60 years old, and he was blind in his right eye. I'm surprised they even let him into the country because they were pretty particular. My mother said they used a regular shoe hook, a hook that they used to close the buttons on the high-top shoes, and they turned the eyelids up to check your eyes for disease. But they let him through.
came out to North Dakota, did he farm?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. But as far back as I can remember, the children did the work. That's the way it was done in Russia. The father didn't do much work. He was just giving the orders. And Grandpa was that way. I can't remember him ever working.
Theresa, do you remember playing any games or activities that your parents or grandparents learned to play while living in Russia?
Only a card game. It was called Durak. And it's, I think it's a Russian name. And that's the only game that we ever played.
And what, can you describe that game?
Yeah, you get 5 cards, and 2, 3, 4 can play. Each player gets 5 cards, and the top card of the pile that's left gets turned over. And then you bring to the one to your right. You have to have at least 2, a pair, and 1 other one to bring. If you can't bring a pair, then you lose your turn. And the one that runs out of cards first is the winner.
Were you the winner, Evan?
Sometimes.
What about toys? What kind of toys did you play?
Never had any toys. I think my youngest sister and I got a doll one time. Must have been a little bit better crop that year or something. And anyway, we each got a doll, and that's the only toy that we ever got. There were no toys. We cut people out of the catalogs and the furniture and all of that. And those were our paper dolls. And we'd sit in one of the sheds and have our paper dolls on the floor. Sometimes a gust of wind would come along, blow them all away. So we'd have to line them all up again. That was our toys.
Now, were those store-bought or homemade?
Cut them out of the catalog.
Those were all store-bought?
Yeah.
None of them were homemade?
No.
Now, I know you had a lot of siblings. Was there any one in particular that you played with more than the others?
My youngest sister and I, and we are still very close.
Did your mother or father ever play with you or your siblings?
Just the cards, but no other game or anything like that.
Where was your favorite place to play?
In the kitchen. That's where we played all the time.
What would you do?
Oh, sit around the kitchen table, and we played whist and the Durak.
Now, do you have any favorite rhymes or sayings or anything like that from growing up?
No, not really. We didn't, can't say that we had any rhymes.
What about any superstitions or scary stories?
Oh,
that you
my
remember?
goodness. They were so superstitious, you cannot believe it. When you got out of the car, you could not walk around the front of the car. You had to walk around the back, because walking around the front of the car was bad luck. If we'd get out of the car and start walking, my father would chase us back. We'd have to go around the back of the car. And, I can't tell you that. If a pregnant woman could not crawl underneath a wire fence, and, it was just, they had a lot of them. And they had their homemade remedies. There were a lot of those, too. Goose grease was one of them. My mother would render the goose fat, and when we had a cold, she'd rub it on our throat. And a stocking, wind a stocking around your throat. And it couldn't be just any stocking. It had to be a stocking that had been worn. If you had an earache, my father would blow smoke in your ear. My mother put a little cook oil in and a piece of cotton, and that took care of the earache. And I don't know, in the first place, we were very seldom sick, very seldom. And if we were, they had their own remedies. Kerosene was the antiseptic. If you had a real bad cold, my mother would get a half a teaspoon of sugar, a couple of drops of kerosene on it, and that's what we took. That was our cough syrup. And it worked. It worked.
Did any of those superstitions ever contradict, say, the teachings of the church? Or was
No.
that just a normal?
No, that was just normal. Well, they had their brauche. I don't know. I don't think the church was against it because my mother did brauch.
What is that?
If someone had like a sty, they would come to her and she would say these prayers over him. Goodness sakes, the sty went away. It did work, but you had to believe. If you didn't believe, it wasn't going to work.
Now, what about scary stories? Did you grow up with any scary stories that you might remember?
What kind of stories?
Scary.
Oh, scary stories.
Did they tell you any scary stories?
Well, yeah, sometimes they scare the heck out of you. I remember I was just maybe 6 or 7 or so, and the well driller was at our house. Something had gone wrong with the well. And he was a big man, I remember, and he was wearing this long black coat. And they didn't get done in time, so he was there for dinner. And my mother was fixing dinner, and she used the coal range. And the coal range had these round plates, and you could take a plate off, and that's where you put the wood in. And sometimes my mother would take that plate off and set the kettle right directly over the flame so it would go faster. Well, she took a plate off and put it to the back of the stove, and I didn't know it was hot, and I leaned on it. And I lifted my arm, and the skin stayed right on that plate. And of course I cried, and she put soda on, and she grabbed me, and she pulled me up to the window, and she said, "Do you see that man out there?" And it was the well driller. She said, "If you don't quit crying, I'm going to tell him he's going to put you in a sack and take you along." And I believed every word. Every word. I quit crying. And there were huge blisters on my arm. I still have the scars. But nowadays, you'd probably end up in the hospital. My mother treated it with soda. And it healed up, and that was the end of that.
The well driller. Now, moving on from scary stories, did you have any favorite songs growing up?
No. We didn't do much singing.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to share about your childhood pastimes?
Well, that about took care of it.
Okay. I'm going to move a little bit from there to seasonal questions.
Okay.
Kind of do it by year. So if you could
Okay.
start, maybe with, the plowing of the land, kind of what your family would do in a year.
Okay. Well, the plowing, that was done by my father and my 2 brothers. My mother never worked in the field during the spring's work. But then after that, after the crop was seeded and it was time to make hay, then we were all out there. My father usually did the mowing. He cut the hay and the grass for the hay, and one would rake it, and then we'd have to load it up on the hay rack and bring it home and unload it by hand, and everybody was out there, including my mother. She set the stack, and she was good at it. When she got done, the stack was just as round. It looked like loaves of bread. She was very good at it. And then it went into harvesting. And first was the bindering. They would binder the oats. And my father would do the bindering, and my mother and brothers and sisters, we were out there and we would shock the grains. You set a shock up on end and put 4 around and 1 on top, and that was a shock. And we'd go up and down the field. And then we headered. My father ran the header. My 2 brothers each had a header box that they pitched the grain, and my mother set the stack. And my youngest sister and I, we drove the header box with the horses. And then after the headering, then came the thrashing. And when the thrashing machine came to our house, I was always real glad, because the day before my mother would go to town, and she'd buy all these good things, So we had a lot of good stuff in our dinner pail. And then came the picking the corn. And that was done late in the fall. Sometimes there was even snow already, and we were still out there picking corn. And during the winter months, my father would rub two cobs together to get the kernels off, and the corn cobs were used to start a fire in the range.
Now, what other crops did your family have?
They had oats and sometimes rye and wheat.
Now, were any of your chores, did those involve helping in the field with those crops?
Oh yes, all of them.
Can you describe some?
Well, they were either bindered or headered, and so we had to help with that. And in between, well, in the spring, usually when the crop was seeded, then we'd go out and pick the rocks and drive with the horses and a wagon, and you'd go up and down the field and pick the rocks. And my sister and I were just small, so we had to pick small rocks, whatever you could handle. Oh, I hated it. Sometimes it would be cloudy and we'd pray that it would rain so that we could quit, and then it would rain a little bit and quit raining, and then we were in worse shape than ever because it was dirty.
Now, you mentioned you drove the header box.
Yes.
When did you learn how to do that?
Oh, about 8, 9.
So what exactly, can you describe what a header box is?
A header box is, one side is real high, the other side is real low. The header has what they call an elevator, and it elevates the grain up onto the header box. And my brother was on the header box. He would take the grain away from the elevator. And I had to drive the header box, and you had to drive just exactly, because you didn't dare go too fast, because if you did, the elevator would elevate the grain onto the ground. So you had to watch what you were doing. And the part I hated most was to turn around at the end of the field. But you had to do it. You had to learn how to do it, and that was the end of it. And then when one header box was full, that brother would go and unload. My mother set the stack, then the other brother would come with his box, and my younger sister drove for him.
So there were the two of you then?
Yes, 2 girls and the 2 boys.
Now, during the winter, of course, you didn't have crops or anything. What did your family do during the winter?
Well, we milked cows, and there were always hogs, and there were always chickens. So the animals had to be fed, and of course you had to, when you milked, you had to separate by hand. You had to turn the handle of the separator, and the separator had to be washed every morning. And there were, I think, about 40 discs, and they were numbered, 1, 2, 3, and you had to wash each one separately, and you had to line them up. 1, 2, 3, all couldn't just any which way. They had to be lined up. And then by that time it was time to go to school.
And when did you start school?
I was 5 when I started. At that time you didn't need a birth certificate or anything when you went to school. When you started school, you just started school. And I think my mother sent me at 5 because I suppose she was tired of kids. That the sooner she got rid of them, the better, and I didn't blame her, and that's why I got to start at 5.
Now, did you start? Well, by then you probably already knew quite a bit of English.
Oh yes.
Did your teacher bring in more of that into the classroom, more language?
Well, yes, we still did have some that didn't understand or speak English, so the teacher would have to have some of the older ones translate.
Now, were your teachers typically young or
from
the area?
Yes, they were from around this area. They weren't just young. I had the same teacher the last 5 years that I went to country school. It was the first 3 years that I had a different teacher every year, and one of them couldn't understand German, couldn't understand it or speak it, so we had to translate a lot. Did
you ever have to do translations for your parents?
Oh yes. If anyone come to the farm that spoke English, we had to translate.
What was that like?
Well, wasn't hard.
Was it just something you did?
Yeah, just something you did. They would ask you questions in English. You translate it to my father or mother in German. They'd answer it in German, and we'd translate back into English.
We talked a little bit about your maternal grandparents. I want to ask you a little bit about your paternal grandparents.
Those I don't know. I
Okay.
have no idea. They stayed in Russia, and my father never talked about him. So.
Now, your mother, you said she immigrated when she was
Yes.
17.
Mm-hmm.
What did
Yes, she did.
What would she tell you about life in the old country?
Well, she told us about one thing. In the morning, they would milk their cows. Every house had a little barn back, and they'd milk the cows in the morning, and then the herdsmen would come and gather up all the cows and take them out to the pasture. And they would herd them because there are no fences over there, none whatsoever. So they had to watch the cows so they wouldn't go into the wheat field. And in the evening, nobody had a watch. They went by the sun. In the evening, they'd bring the cows back, and each cow knew where to go. Then they'd milk the cows and keep them in that enclosure overnight, and the next day the herdsman would come and pick them up again. And it's still done that way. When I was over there in 2002, it was still done the same way. I couldn't get over it.
What about your mother's school?
She went to school, yes, then the original school is still there, and but they, in German. German was the language.
Now, did you bring anything back from your trip?
A shawl. Mm-hmm. They all wore a head shawl, so I had to have a shawl.
I think I want to talk a little bit about weddings and traditions.
Okay.
I'd like to touch on that. Skip here. Okay. Now, how did you meet your spouse?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
At a dance.
Can you describe that dance?
It was in town here, and he came from Wishick, and of course that was, at that time, that was quite a ways away, and that's where we met.
What was your parents' attitude towards him?
Not very good at first, because he wasn't Catholic, so that was one big drawback. But they were pretty tolerant. They didn't kick up too big a fuss. I had a wedding.
Well, speaking of weddings, when and where did you get married?
We got married here at St. Philip's. But when my older sisters got married, especially the oldest one, at that time, the weddings were always in the morning. The wedding mass was always in the morning. And the wedding was celebrated in the home of the bride's parents. Not always, but most of the time. And we had such a small house, And there were all these uncles and aunts and cousins, and they got married in the wintertime. It was cold. I don't know what they did with all those people, but we were all in that little house. And being that they were married in the morning, that meant that my mother had to prepare a noon meal plus supper. And they even danced. They pushed the furniture, the side of along the wall, and they danced. And all the coons were good dancers. They were all good dancers.
What kind of dances would you do at
Waltzes and polkas. And we learned very young how to dance.
Is that something you would do on, say, a family night? You would just go out there and dance, or where did you originally learn?
Well, we learned at home, really. When my sister got married, my grandma Coon, was teaching her little grandsons how to dance. And she was dancing with one of my brothers, and he was about 10 or so. And she stepped on his foot. And so he cried. And my mother asked, "What is the problem?" And he said, Grandma stepped on my foot. And the way we were brought up, you didn't blame your elders for anything, especially not your grandmother of all people. So my mother, who was pretty short on patience anyway, she let him have one alongside the head. So the poor kid, he was crying and crying. He had a sore foot plus a sore head. And that's how we learned.
So after that dance, they made sure you were taught.
Yes. I don't think my brother danced the rest of the night, but he had had enough.
Now, how old were you at that time?
I was 5.
Okay, I'm going to transition a little bit back to your wedding. Will you tell me a little bit about the wedding and your reception?
We were married at St. Philip's, and then we had a reception at the, it was the City Hall at that time. And then we had a dance.
Now, did you have any attendance? Or
Oh, yes, yes. I had 2 bridesmaids, and we had 2 best men. There were no flower girls or ring bearers. It wasn't used so much yet at that time.
Now, what was a wedding mass like?
Well, it's about the same as any other, except that the vows are spoken. Otherwise, the mass is about the same.
Any traditions that you remember?
Yes, way back when my 2 oldest sisters got married, it was a tradition that when the bride and groom walked into the house where the wedding was being celebrated, there would be a musician standing by the door, usually an accordion player, and he would play while the couple moved in or walked in. I don't know what it meant, but it was done all the time.
Were you at weddings where they would do that?
Yes, yes.
Did they do money dances at that point?
No, no. There wasn't enough money to go around. So.
Now, what type of foods were served at weddings?
Usually at noon they had soup, and they had fried chicken, they had potatoes, and kuchen was a tradition. There was no wedding cake.
And who would usually make the food for these weddings?
Usually the mother or the bride. She would help, have help. Her sisters would come and help the day before, but help butcher the chickens and so cut up the cabbage for the coleslaw. But it was the bride's mother that was responsible for all of it.
So that was a big job.
Yes, it was. Must have been a nightmare for my mother with such a small house, but they managed.
Was there anything unusual about your courtship or wedding?
No.
Pretty normal.
Pretty normal.
Did you have a honeymoon?
No. We got married, and the next morning we milked cows.
Well, is there anything else regarding wedding traditions that you would like to add?
I can't think of anything else.
Let's see. Covered a little bit of everything. Let's see. Here, talk a little bit about childhood again. What was your most stressful childhood experience?
Oh, the most stressful. To tell you the truth, we were never stressed out. I can't ever remember that we complained or anything. It was just a way of life, and you lived it, and that was the end of it.
What was your happiest childhood memory?
Oh, I suppose the Christmases.
Do you have a particular one that stands out more?
Just the one where we got a doll.
How old were you?
I think I must have been about 8 or so.
Now, how would your mother wrap gifts?
Never wrapped them.
Never wrapped them.
Mm-mm. She just, oh my, no. There was no money for wrapping paper or anything like that. She just handed it to you. She hid it until Christmas Eve, and then she handed it to you and said, "This is your present." And that was it.
Can you describe a typical Christmas, like what your family would do?
Well, like I said, after supper we got our goodies, and we went to Mass, midnight Mass, and on Christmas Day we went to church again on Christmas morning, and then we had the roast goose for dinner, and we always had a Christmas goose.
What was the most adventurous thing you did during your childhood?
Oh, gee. We weren't too very adventuresome. We didn't take chances. My mother was too strict.
Did you ever want to?
Well, I suppose we were tempted, but then you always had to remember, if Ma finds out, then what's going to happen then? And that kind of put a damper on everything.
Well, is there anything else about your childhood memories you would like to add?
I think we've covered most of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Theresa, can you tell us about this shawl? Maybe what they were used for, how they were made?
This shawl I purchased in Yalta. And my mother did have a shawl. It was all black that she brought from the old country. But one of my older sisters has that. It is usually handed down to the oldest daughter. And I know all of my mother's sisters and sisters-in-law and her mother. They all had black shawls. They wore them a lot in the wintertime when it was cold. They put them over their heads.
What about how they were made?
They were made, I don't know exactly what the material was, but they were heavy. They were used mostly for warmth.
Do you know if women made them from homespun wool?
Oh, I don't know if they did. I'm sure they were homemade somehow, but I don't know if it was wool or what it was.
Theresa, can you tell us about the dress you have on?
This dress belongs to a good friend of mine, Rose Burgad. And Rose is 96 years old. And Rose's mother, Rosa Drager, made this dress. So it's well over 100 years old. This was Mrs. Drager's Sunday best. You'll notice that it has the little buttons down the front. It's made of taffeta. She lined the sleeves, the cuffs, in red. And you'll notice the length.
Can you tell us about your shoes?
These are shoes that I've had for a long time. In fact, I wore this dress and the shoes 25 years ago when Napoleon celebrated its 100th birthday. And now 25 years later, here I am in the same outfit.
What about your hat?
The hat is also very old. And I don't know just exactly how old it is, but I know it's old because you can see how high it is. That was the fashion at that time.
Now, what about the shawl?
The shawl, I bought the shawl in Yalta, in the Ukraine, when I was there in 2002. Everyone over there wears one of these shawls, so I just had to have one.
What kind of comments do you get on the dress when you wear it to celebrations?
Oh, people just can't believe that this dress is that old and still in such good shape.
Do you have any good stories that may have been passed down about that dress?
No, I don't. All I know is that Rosa Drager made this dress. It was her Sunday best.
Now, would she only wear it to church?
Yes, yes.
Do you know how long it would take to make a dress like that?
I have no idea, but I'm sure it would take quite a while because everything was done by hand, I'm sure.
Oh, can you turn for us? Show us that. Now, would they usually wear their shawls like that?
Yes, a lot of them, the older ones, wore them over the head.
Why would they do that?
Well, they wore them in the wintertime for warmth. But all the ladies, at least from what I can remember, they all wore hats. Every woman and girl, child had to have a head covering when you went to church.
Now, would your mother wear?
Oh, yes. In fact, she would never have thought of going to town to buy groceries without wearing a hat.
Did you ever wear your mother's hat?
No.
Did you ever have one of your own?
Oh, yes, yes. We did have a hat. One for a summer hat that we wore for years. In the wintertime, it was usually a shawl.
And what did the hats look like that you would wear?
They were usually like a sailor hat, that style.
Now, would you wear them on any special occasions?
Only to church.
Now, you wore this dress to, what was it, the 25th?
The 100th anniversary.
100th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to wear it?
Yes, I'll be wearing it at the style show.
What is the style show?
We have dresses, or not only dresses, but different costumes according to decades, from the 1800s, the late 1800s, up to about 50 or 60.
Now, are a lot of the older ones in as good of condition as the one you're wearing?
There is one there that is in real good condition, and it was handmade too, and it has a bustle.
Do you know what the bustles were used for?
Pardon me?
Just style? The bustle on the back of a dress?
What style?
Yeah, what they would, why a bustle?
Well, that's just the way the dresses were at that time.
Do you have any other shawls?
No, this is the only one I have. So my daughters will have to fight over it.
Who's going to get the dress?
Well, the dress will go back to its owner because I borrowed it.
Are there any other tidbits that you would like to tell us about this dress? Maybe what kind of custom it was to dress up for church? Or?
Well, yes, it was the custom that my mother was the same way. They had one Sunday dress. Usually it was black, and that was worn to church.
Why black?
Well, I think it was a basic color. They could use it to church and to a funeral. They didn't have the money to buy a lot of dresses.
Now, I want to talk about your shoes a little bit. Were those the typical style?
That was the style, yes. Mm-hmm.
And how old were those?
These are not so old.